Hello, and welcome to the Book Stacks. My name is Courtney, and today I'm going to be discussing my reading stats or my reading statistics for the year of 2022. A couple years ago, I was really inspired by Books and Lala to do this kind of a video to track my reading, and honestly, it's been life-changing. I like knowing how I read. I just like knowing what kind of reader I am, figuring out what kind of books I read throughout the year, and with that, what kind of things I want to change as a reader. A lot of people on BookTube do this, but again, I was inspired by Books and Lala. So I've been tracking my reading throughout the entire year, mainly using Book Roast reading spreadsheet. I highly recommend it. It is such a great tool. I will leave a link to her newest one for 2023 in the comments. And now it's time to share my reading and my results with you. So for the year of 2022, I read 100 books. So yay, I made it to my goal. This was really great because in 2021, I only reached 69 books. So definitely an improvement. And then here is like a graph of my reading throughout the years. It remains pretty consistent. I read about 800 books a year. There have been a few miss years where I've only read about 70-ish books, like last year. But for the most part, I stay really consistent at that 100 mark. And for pages read this year, I read 29,688 pages. And in comparison to last year, where I read 23,218 books, there's definitely been some improvement. Most of that, though, is probably just because I actually read more books versus reading book length, which we will see. So for my book length, the most popular length I read was 150 to 200, which is manga and some of the novellas I read, but mostly manga. And my second most popular length was 350 books to 400. So those are more like a standard fantasy size. Most of my books stay in like that 350 range, 400, somewhere over in there. And then of course we have the novellas and mangas. But I don't tend to reach for a lot of books that are bigger than 500 pages, so that's definitely something I want to think about and work on maybe for next year. And for hours listened, I listened to 537 hours this year. I have nothing to compare it to. I don't know what that means, but a goal for next year is to read more physically, so maybe we'll see this number go down in the next year. So let's just go over a little bit of an overview before we get into the big stats. So my longest book of the year was Bloodmarked, which was 576 pages. My shortest book was This Winter, which was 106. And both of those books were 3-ish stars. So book length does not seem to be really an importance to me. My favorite books were neither my longest book or my shortest book. For rereads, not counting manga, I only reread one book, and that would be My Side of the Mountain, which also happened to be the oldest book I read this year because it was published in the 1950s. And here's a chart of the pub dates that I read from this year. There are a few outliers, some in like the 80s, 90s, but for the most part, most of my books are coming from the last 5 years. A lot of them are coming from 2022 and 2021 because I'm a lot of times playing catch up on things that I've seen people talk about in the last couple years, and I want to read them. And getting into that, not counting manga this year, I read 17 new releases, so 17 books that were published in 2022. I have a whole video discussing all of those books if you want more of my thoughts and opinions, so definitely check that out. But also here's a brief pick of some of those books. Again, pub year doesn't seem to matter in terms of how much I'm going to like a book because there are some of my favorite books for the year from my new releases, and there's also books that I felt very meh about in the new releases category. But I will say that my new releases, it's something that I like to work on and have wanted to put a priority on because I do like reviewing and talking about new books. So from last year, I only read 14 books, so I definitely improved by reading at least 3 more new releases. So let's get into the nitty-gritty statistics. So for format, I read 1 ebook, 40 audiobooks, 54 physical books, and then 6 mixed media. So that means I read them both as an audiobook and a physical book. I tend to pick one form and just kind of stick with it. And audiobooks have been such a great help as a reader, especially when I've been in reading slumps. It's something that really got me through the pandemic, was being able to use an audiobook as a way to focus on the reading when I was really struggling to sit down and read for more than a 10-minute increment of time. But it is something that I want to slowly pull back from because I feel more connected to books when I read them physically. So that is something that I think we'll see a shift in the statistic. And this is also something that I think my new spreadsheet from Book Roast really will help me track better. There's certain statistics like audiobooks that I wasn't tracking super well on my own, so I'm hoping that going into next year, we can actually see more of those statistics and see either which way it goes. For the types of books, I read 53 novels, 7 novellas, 29 manga, 8 graphic novels, and 4 short story collections. As far as in comparison to 2021, I read 49 novels, 3 novellas, 9 manga, 3 graphic novels, and 3 short story collections. So really, the amount of novels I read in a year isn't really changing. What's really changing is the other forms that I read. So I read more novellas this year, more graphic novels, more short story collections, and most importantly, more manga. That really does seem to make a difference in how many books I read. It's hard because I love manga. It's a part of my reading. I don't even catalog all the manga I read. I only catalog the ones that I'm buying physically and showing off. So in reality, I read a lot more manga than I'm even showing in statistics. But I also would like my number of read books to be more. It would be great if I could read 60 or 70 physical actual books in a year, which I guess I probably got close to that if you add everything up. But it would be cool to read even more of that, to read like 120 books and for 30 of those to be manga. So that's something to keep an eye on for next year. And then let's get into the books I bought this year. So I have a whole video where I had a haul for my entire year, every single book I bought in 2022. So check that video out if you want a more in-depth video of my buying. My buying habits are something that I want to not keep in check because I don't think I buy too extravagantly, which we will discuss in a minute, but it is something that I just want to know the actual amounts for everything. How many books I buy, how much money I spent, I want to know that number. So that's something that I will be doing in the new year. But I will say, I started out this year not talking about manga, just physical books. I started out this year with a TBR of 18 books that I had acquired before the beginning of 2022. Of those 18, I read 13 of them and I got rid of 2. Which means that I only have 3 books on my TBR that I acquired before the year of 2022, which I think is really, really good. I stayed on track with my TBR. Yes, I bought a lot of books, but I don't have an entirely giant backlog of books that I need to read that I've had on my shelf for multiple years, which for me is something that's important. It's not important to everybody, but it is for me. I like to have a small TBR. I like to pick up books as I feel the need to read them. So of the books that I bought in 2022 that I haven't read, not including manga again, I have 8 books on my physical TBR that I but there are 8 books on my TBR that I'd like to read before 2023 to, again, stay on top of my TBR. So let's get into my month by month reading. So if we want to look at page count, here is a chart of that. As you can see, my best month was July, where I read 12 books. And if we want to go over to page count, my best month would be May, where I read 3,465 pages. For the most part, it remains pretty consistent. There are definitely some months where it fluctuates. For instance, my worst month is February. It has always been February. It will always be February, it feels like. As far as page count goes, May and December were neck and neck, and most of my reading falls between a little under 2,000 to a little under 3,000 pages read. Which makes sense if we go back to my months, because I tend to read about 8.4 books a month. And as far as like my best reading months in terms of reading, honestly, the star rating for every month is kind of hard to pick which one was the best month, because every month that I had like a 5-star in or a 4.5 star in or just one of my favorite books that I read in, I also have like a 2-star or a 3-star. But just at giving a quick glance, I would say my best reading month was, I believe this is May, where I read the Bear and the Nightingale series as well as the first 2 books in the Foundry Side series. So I obviously didn't take a close enough look because my best reading month was obviously April. I read 3 5-stars and 1 4-star and a bunch of other reads that I really enjoyed. There was one miss in there, but for the most part it was stuff that I enjoyed. So April is the best month. But I am kind of, not surprised, but I'm happy that my 5 stars are spread throughout the month. There like isn't one month where I read the best books. Let's go look at those star ratings. So for my ratings, I read, again, this is not going to include manga because that really just, it sways the chart a lot. But I read 10 books that I gave 5 stars to, and this is rounding down. So all my 3.5s are going to be with my 3s, all my 4.5s are going to be with my 5s. But again, 5 stars, 10 books. 4 stars, 35 books. 3 stars, 23. 2 stars, 5 books. And 1 star, 0 books. I just tend to not rate things 1 star unless I really, really despised them. And while I did have books that I really disliked, I don't think I read anything that I deeply, deeply despised. But yeah, looking at the chart, let's switch over to my just static picture of the stacks. I believe it's going to be my left. It should be on this side. Okay, so going back to that picture, on that side, which I'm guessing is to the right of the screen, those are all my 5 stars. I have my 5 stars, and then right next to it I have my 4.5, or just books that I really, really enjoyed in that stack. I definitely noticed when I was making the stack, I was definitely fiddling around a lot with it. So I definitely might have to look at my ratings, because as the year has gone by, certain books have stuck with me, both in a good way and a bad way. And then I felt like some of the reading experiences were better with some books than others. Some books have stuck out of my mind in a really good way and stuck with me, so they've gotten a higher rating. And then books that I've given 4 stars have just kind of not sticked in my memory, or they've stuck in a bad way. And so like the reading experience couldn't make up for the book's technical skill. So the next stack next to that 4.5 is the largest stack. Those are my 4 stars. Next to that is 3.5s, 3.75s, just anything that I felt was above a 3. Next we have my 3 stars, which are my middle of the road books that I felt mediocre about, I guess. It's hard because even in the 3.5 stack, and maybe even a little bit in the 3 stack, there were definitely some books that in here that didn't stick with me, but I thought were good. Or even there were some books that I liked, thought were really good, really enjoyed them, but I just didn't think the technical skill was up there. So yeah, I have a hard time rating books, I guess. Yeah, my last stack, those are gonna be the 2.5 to 5 stars. Mostly the books I didn't enjoy. I definitely found myself putting books that I had given a higher rating to in that stack, just because I was like, oh yeah, I really didn't like this. I really did think this is one of the worst books I read. But I'm definitely gonna have a video talking about the worst books I read, so again, stay tuned. So many videos coming. But in comparison to last year, I read 12 5 stars, 37 4 stars, 19 3 stars, and 1 2 stars. So definitely there have been a lot more 3s and 2s this year. Even like percentage wise, looking at the graph, there definitely have been some wiggling, which I think is good. I think it's good that my rating has changed, because I don't consider a 3-star a bad book, but I've been slowly adjusting my star rating to better reflect what I really think about reading. For me, my standard is like, oh, this book was enjoyable, or oh, this book was well crafted. It wasn't for me, but it was well crafted. I'll give it a 4 star. And like, that is not helpful. My midpoint should be 3 star. My midpoint of this book was good, I liked it, or the craft here was good, but it wasn't for me. It should be a 3 star instead of a 4 star. So slowly adjusting that. But let's get into age range. This was something I was thinking a lot about. I definitely want to shift more into adult. It's hard because I do love my YA queer contemporary novels. There's something very healing about reading those. But where I'm at, the best books I'm reading are tending to be adult. And this year I read 38 adult, 55 YA, 3 middle grade, 3 children, 2 new adult. And if we compare that to last year, I read 1 middle grade / children's book, 31 YA, and 37 adult. And so I want to continue to read more adult. I want that to be most of my reading, because that's when I tend to have a really good reading year, I think. As far as genres, before we get into my pie chart and the nitty gritty, I want to just take a look at my photo. So this, I rearranged the books from most realistic to most fantastical. So starting off on what should be the right hand side of the screen is nonfiction. So these are memoirs, these are nonfiction stories, and then next to that we have just general contemporary novels. In the middle we have all the fantastical books that take place mostly in our world. If they were placed in our world but so far in the future or so fantastical, I moved them into the fantasy. But the middle stack, it should be just the books that are paranormal, mythology, just anything that's fantastical or speculative, but that's still really focused on our world. And then the final stacks are going to be the fantastical, whole fantasy worlds, the so distant in the future that it's not really our world anymore. And that's where my heart lies. I love my YA contemporary. I love reading just different kinds of books, reading nonfiction, but my heart, it starts in speculative and it goes into fantastical. As far as genres, if we break it down farther, I read 45 contemporaries. A lot of contemporary manga, because I'm reading Haikyuu and Welcome to the Ballroom, I think that really swayed it in that direction. I have 17 fantasies, 14 sci-fi, 10 speculative fiction. This was mythology, actual speculative fiction, paranormal, just anything that couldn't be classified as hardcore fantasy or sci-fi landed in speculative, 6 nonfiction, 6 historical fiction / literary fiction, and 2 mystery thriller / horror. I just kind of lumped things into categories because there was only like one book in each category. But if we lump all the fantasy sci-fi together, I believe that is 41 fantasy sci-fi books, so it really kind of does remain even with the contemporary and the sci-fi, which I'm pleasantly surprised by. Comparing it to last year, I read 26 fantasy books, 9 speculative, 14 sci-fi, 3 nonfiction, 13 romance contemporary, 1 horror, and 3 historical fiction. So definitely 2021 was a year of fantasy for me, and it's so hard. It's so hard because I have so many YA contemporary, so many queer stories that are YA contemporary that I want to read, but I really do love my speculative fantasy stuff. And speaking of sci-fi fantasy, let's take a look at the series that I read this year. So I have a whole video dedicated to the series that I read, but 65 of my 100 books were part of a series. Again, a lot of these are manga, but I did finish and read a lot of series this year. So I just wanted to clear things up and say, in these statistics where I'm showing the books, I am not counting manga or graphic novels, and because of that, and just because I'm bad at math, I did miss some series and put some series in when I shouldn't have. So the pictures are right, but the numbers I'm saying are probably not right. So I started out the year with 10 series that I was in the middle of. And in that year, I finished 8 of them, and I kept up with 4 of them. And then I started another 8. So that means I went from 10 series in progress to 12 series in progress. In comparison, 2021, I completed 7 series. I'm not sure how many series I had in progress, but I completed 7, caught up on 5, and started 6. It always seems to be pretty equal. I have always about 10 series that I'm reading. The next stat I have is a new to me stat. I think this is a really fun stat, but it's the publishers that I read from. I should really break this down into the big 5 so that we can really see how many Penguin Random House I'm reading versus Simon & Schuster. But I do think just looking at imprints is really interesting because there definitely are imprints that I gravitate towards. So the imprint I read the most from was Kodansha Comics, which I read 14 of. That's Welcome to the Ballroom. That's some of my other comics. It makes sense why it's up there. But going into novels, I read the most from Tor this year with 12 books. I want to get into this statistic in a separate video that might be coming out next year. Without looking at my star rating, Tor is a good imprint for me. I tend to pick up a lot from them. And then after that with 11 books is Del Rey, again another fantasy imprint. I'm actually surprised Orbit and Harper Voyager is not up here too, because I do think I read a couple from them, but I guess Tor and Del Rey are the 2 imprints that I reached the most for, or have had the most books that I've been interested in. For my authors, I read 42 new to me authors, and I've read 59 authors that I've read from before. With reading series, of course you're reading a lot of the same author over and over again, but some of the new favorite authors that I've come across, authors that I read for the first time this year that I really enjoyed, were Niveau. I really liked their writing, really excellent. And then ML Rio. I can't believe that they don't have any more books out. I really enjoyed We Were Villains, and I would love something else from them. As far as my newly favorited authors that I've read more than one book for, authors that I'm definitely planning on reading more stuff from, Tamsin Muir. I'm just really loving the Locked Tomb series. I'm really excited for what else she has in store. And then Becky Chambers. This year I completed the Wayfarer series as well as completing the Psalm for the Wild Build series. I only have one more book that I haven't read from her, but she's just like a must-buy author from me now. And then as far as authors that I read the most from, I read the most from Tomo Takechi. I read all 11 of the Welcome to the Ballroom series, and after that, the most I read was Haruichi Furudate, which is Haikyuu, which I read 8 books from. And then my third most read author was Mizuho Kusanagi, which I read 4 books from, and that is the Yona the Dawn series. But getting into authors that I read 3 or more books from, I have Alice Oseman, Catherine Arden, Robert Jackson Bennett, Emily Skrunsky, and Becky Chambers. Again, these are all fantasy series people, mostly. Alice Oseman, not so much, although I feel like she could write some really interesting fantasy. But most of my authors that I read from have ongoing series, so it makes sense that I read more than one book from them. And then my author stats. So I decided that I'm going to be starting to keep these stats private. I don't think it's really private because you can see all the books that I read each year. But I've just been thinking a lot about the line of me being transparent and keeping myself in check of the kinds of authors that I'm reading from, and also like being overly calculating or like braggy on the internet about the kinds of people that I'm reading from. And the author's stats that I'm talking about are race, place of origin, gender, sexuality, that kind of stuff. I've been doing those stats for the past couple years on my channel because I did want that transparency, was something that I was really focusing on and really thinking about. And it is something that I'm going to continue to track and do. I just decided I want to be a little more private, or I wouldn't say private because again, you can see and calculate the books that I've read, but it's something that I don't want to go into like specific detail all the time for, especially like in this video, because I feel like it just gets over calculating and weird in some respects, and that's just not where I am right now. Like I don't need to keep doing that right now, if that makes sense. It made sense to do it in years past, but it's like I'm keeping myself in check. I know what I'm reading, I know how I'm reading, I am tracking it, and I will gladly like share it with anybody, but I don't think I need to be so specific and calculating about it, at least online anymore. I can just do that self-reflection in private. And I think it's a really hard line. I don't think one way is more right than the other way. Like being transparent on the internet about reading POC authors and reading queer authors, like for now, there's just a different way I want to express. I will say though, for transparency's sake, I had very lofty goals for myself, and this year was a very weird transitional year for me as like a human being. I was moving, trying to get a job, going through a really, really deep set depression, and those things should not affect how I read. I don't want to use them as excuses, but they did affect my reading. I read about the same amount of POC voices that I read this year, but I read a lot more diversity. Like I read from a lot of people that have a lot of different origins than I have in years past. So I read from a lot of different places throughout the world, a lot of different backgrounds, and because of that, the amount of Black authors that I read went down. I had lofty goals for my translated books and from reading from people from different countries. I did read a couple of translated books. Besides manga, I only read like 2 or 3 translated books. And again, it's something that I want to think about. It's something that I realized I didn't set myself up to succeed. I hadn't done enough research. I had realized that really quickly at the beginning of the year. So that is something that I want to think about because my reading was overall from nationalities or places, countries that speak majority English. I'm overwhelmingly an American reader. Because of the publishing industry makes a lot of sense, but it is something that I want to push against. I read about the same amount of LGBT reads I read every year, and I read more disabled voices this year, or books with disabled characters, but I am going to be doing more reflection on backgrounds that I'm reading from. But yes, these are all the books that I read in 2022. I still have to come out with my best and worst of the year, so be looking for that so we can discuss what were the best books I read, what were the worst books I read, and then we can get into 2022 goals, TBRs, all kinds of fun stuff. I have a lot of fun plans for this next year, and planning and doing statistics, it's something that I love to do, and I really feel like it makes me a better reader. So I'm definitely going to continue into next year, so look forward to that. Let me know, what did you read this year? What was the best books you've read this year? Do you track your reading? How do you do it? I would love to know, but thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys later, and happy reading.